You found this video, which means you are ready to dominate your fantasy football leagues, but that starts with one thing, and that's finding the wide receivers that are absolute traps and finding the ones that are actually good value. And that's all going to come to you in this video because we're doing the top wide receiver tiers. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. It might just be the difference between you winning and losing a fantasy football league. It takes 2 seconds, but I don't like wasting people's time. The number one wide receiver this year is CeeDee Lamb. And I'll make it quick. This guy is still very much in his prime. He's only 25 years old. He's on a Cowboys offense that is absolutely amazing as far as passing volume goes. And you can cross-check that with their last season stats. They were top 3 in passing touchdowns, passing yards, passing attempts, everything. That's not going to change this year, especially now that they have an even worse run game with an old Ezekiel Elliott. He should have a 30% target share on an offense that really doesn't have much competition outside of Brandon Cooks and maybe Jake Ferguson. He's easily the number one. That's not going to change. He will improve from last season, but keeping it in the S tier for our number 2 wide receiver in this tier ranking list, it's going to be Tyreek Hill, and you can't really expect him to move much farther down than this. He almost had 2,000 receiving yards on the season. That's pretty impressive on its own. The only reason he's behind CeeDee Lamb here is because he is 30 years old. Statistically, wide receivers that get to this age over 30 just don't really repeat the seasons that they had before. Yes, I understand Tyreek is an absolute anomaly to that. He's going to be amazing again this year, which is why we're taking him at the number 2. He's a freak athlete. This offense is amazing. He's always going to be the number 1. He's always going to be that guy that the Dolphins plan plays for and make red zone plays for. It's not going to change, but he is getting up there, and there's a lot of young, really good wide receivers and really good offenses moving down this list that have a high potential of finishing as that wide receiver 1. He can definitely do it, but moving to the wide receiver 3, sticking in this S tier here, is Jamar Chase, and he's not as much of a risk as everybody else is saying that he is. Most notably, Joe Burrow is going to be coming back from injury. He will be fully healthy this time. Jamar Chase is going to be fully healthy too, so is their offensive line. The team is young. They're a pass-heavy team. He's easily the number 1 option, especially if T. Higgins leaves. He's going to move up probably a couple spots in the rankings, but he doesn't need T. Higgins to leave to finish as a top 3 wide receiver easily because they already lost Tyler Boyd, their number 3 wide receiver, and Joe Mixon in the offseason, so they don't have much of a choice but to go to T. Higgins and Jamar Chase, and they're already a very top-heavy offense. They don't really get a bunch of other guys involved outside of their top guys, and they've been that way since Joe Burrow's joined the team. This should be the season where he starts to recreate that rookie season where he finished as the wide receiver 5. He finished as the wide receiver 11 last year, which wasn't bad. He had Jake Browning. He was also in and out with injuries. Like, it makes sense. So I would guarantee a wide receiver 10 floor for him, even if Joe Burrow were to get injured again. So there really isn't that much downside with him. But continuing with the S tier is Justin Jefferson, and if you've been wondering where he is in this list, now he's here. But JJ McCarthy is a downgrade from Kirk Cousins, which is why I have him this low. He is still the most talented wide receiver in the entire NFL who succeed with whatever offense he's on, and I'm sure JJ McCarthy will be better than a lot of people are expecting him to be, but it's just not going to be anywhere near the Kirk Cousins passing level offense that they had before, which made him a wide receiver 1 consistently. And he still has that target competition with Jordan Addison going into his second year, with TJ Hawkinson going into his second year with the Vikings, and we have JJ McCarthy at quarterback. I promise you he's going to be able to support at least one of them fantasy wise, but there's just so many mouths to feed in this offense. I don't know if he's going to be able to keep Justin Jefferson as like that top 5, top 2, top 1 fantasy wide receiver. But next to him in this tier is another guy, Amon-Ra St. Brown. He also has a lot of target competition though. Like Justin Jefferson, they have Jahmyr Gibbs going to be a pretty big role in the receiving game out of the backfield. They have Jameson Williams, if you want to call it that, Sam Laporta obviously, but also he's really young. He's been improving every single year. If you look at his stats, he's just been doing great even with more target competition, and this offense has not changed. They still have Jared Goff, who's proven to be a decent, fine quarterback for supporting him and other fantasy options. Again, he's only 24, so there's also that argument that he's not even in his prime yet. He's still very, very young. He has another 2 years, 3 years to get to that peak prime, to play at that peak prime for a couple years till he decreases, but that's another story for another time. He also plays primarily in the slot, which means he's going to get a lot of targets. All of the top wide receivers in fantasy football play a majority of their snaps in the slot because they're not as volatile with super deep routes that they're going to get a good touchdown, 50-yard touchdown on, but like slot wide receivers get short passes. They are really good yard after the catch guys. They get a lot of fantasy points with the receptions and obviously the yards. And the sports books have the Lions projected for one of the best offenses in the NFL again. And if we know anything about sports books and Vegas and sports bets and all that kind of stuff, they know way more than we could ever know. So you can go off that and it's going to be a pretty safe bet. Finally though, moving down to the A tier is AJ Brown, and he's another great wide receiver, but he's not as much of a clear-cut wide receiver 1, amazing, separate himself from the rest as all of these other guys, which is why he's in the A tier. And he does have a bit more target competition with Devonta Smith, with Dallas Goedert, if you want to call it that, under the new offensive coordinator with Kellen Moore, and this is a really important part of why I have him ranked this way. I would not be surprised whatsoever if he tries to shorten the gap between AJ Brown and Devonta Smith as far as wide receiver 1 and 2 goes with with usage, targets, all of that. So I am a little bit skeptical on that sense. But again, when you have Jalen Hurts as quarterback, you're going to be fine either way. The offense is going to be great. But they did add Saquon Barkley to this offense, who's going to require a good amount of usage, even targets out of the backfield that will be taken from AJ Brown. So there definitely are some drawbacks with the target competition and all the touchdown options that could be taken from him. But don't be worried about touchdowns specifically. It's one of the most volatile stats in fantasy football, if not the most. You really can't predict it. But the sports books have him for 10 touchdowns on the season compared to his 7 from last season. So I'm really not worried about him. One thing I really do like about AJ Brown though is that you can potentially finish the first couple rounds of your draft with the AJ Brown and Jalen Hurts stack, and that is going to be killer compared to if you were going to do that with a Amon-Ra and Jared Goff, or even a JJ McCarthy and Justin Jefferson. It's not as appealing. But a pretty close second to him in this tier is Puka, and I have been back and forth on this for a while. Just look at what he did last season. He was a 23-year-old rookie in the NFL and comes out and is the wide receiver 4 in fantasy football with 1,500 yards. That's pretty darn impressive. Now we do have to be realistic. Did a lot of this come from Cooper Kupp's injury and he wasn't on the field, so there was more targets out there for him? Yes, it did, but he's still amazingly talented, and you just can't finish as a wide receiver 4 for no reason. He's on an offense like the Bengals that are heavily dependent on their stars. Outside of the Cooper Kupp, the Kyron Williams, and the Puka Nacua, there's really nobody else that gets a lot of work. Like, they have Higbee, he's a good tight end. Not really enough work to take away from him though, fantasy football wise. It's a really efficient offense. Matthew Stafford can support multiple fantasy wide receivers. He's done it before. And Cooper Kupp is 31 years old, so he's gonna take a step back after his injury as well. And again, we can cross-check that with the sports books. They have Cooper Kupp projected for 950 total yards in the season, and Puka for over 1,000. I think 1,100 something. Keeping it in this tier, we're gonna get Garrett Wilson next up, and this one kind of feels like we're buying into a dream because he really hasn't performed that much. He finished as the wide receiver 21 and then the wide receiver 26 last year, and now all of a sudden we're taking him top 10 in fantasy football. This is one of those situations where the numbers just really do not do him justice. He was playing with a whole bunch of different quarterbacks that had this offense consistently bottom 3 in every single efficiency stat. He has Aaron Rodgers coming back. Even a 40-year-old Aaron Rodgers coming off injury will 100% guaranteed be better than all of the quarterback options they had before. And when he has Aaron Rodgers, he's going to get the targets to justify this high of a pick. The only drawbacks is that they did sign Mike Williams if you think he's going to be healthy the whole season, and then they drafted another wide receiver. You shouldn't worry about those other guys. They're more of complementary pieces. Mike Williams is a pretty good deep threat kind of guy. Who knows how much time on field he's really going to get, but the Jets are projected for 11 wins this season, which is a pretty big jump from the seasons before. So it's kind of a given that they're going to be good. They're going to score touchdowns. Garrett Wilson on the sports books is projected for over 1,200 yards on the season. He's only 23 years old. Again, young, not in his prime yet, still very much getting there. Perfectly fine taking him at this ADP. And I do have Marvin Harrison next in this tier. If you've watched any of my previous videos this season, you know that I'm a little bit skeptical on his just ADP in general. I think he's an amazing wide receiver, but again, we don't draft players because we like them. We draft them looking at their ADP and the opportunity cost. And right now, he's being drafted at the 1-2 turn in fantasy football drafts. That is insanely early for a rookie wide receiver that has proved absolutely nothing. I would not be surprised if he's a consistent first-round pick. And my issue with him is that his ADP is pretty much drafting him at his peak. You really think he can be better than Puka Nacua, Garrett Wilson, Jamar Chase, or Justin Jefferson this season? I really find that hard to believe in his first year ever in the NFL with Kyler Murray. The margin for error of the chance of him just being a top wide receiver at this ADP just really hurts me, which is why everybody loves to see sleeper videos, because he'll draft a guy like Jaden Reed in the last round of fantasy drafts and he'll return a 5th round fantasy football value to you. He most definitely will finish as a top 15 wide receiver in fantasy football, but are we going to get that much value for where we're drafting him at? That is the question. I do like the Cardinals. I think they're going to improve this season. I think Kyler Murray is a way better quarterback than people are giving him credit for. But ideally, you want to finish your first 2 rounds in fantasy football with really solid upside guys that don't carry too much risk. So when you get later into your draft, you have more opportunity to take those risks because you have a solid base. And again, if we look at the sports books, he's projected for 1,000 receiving yards pretty much exactly. That's not amazing. It's not great. I think he's a fine pick. If he drops into the mid-second round, late-second round, I'll be fine with it. Anywhere near the first round is a little too much for me, though. But moving down to the B tier, we do have Brandon Ayuk, and this one does pretty much depend entirely on what's going to go on in the offseason. If you see the Commanders jersey back there, you know where I want him to go, but if we're being realistic, this is what I think he's going to do. I think he's posting on the account, talking about Jane Daniels, hanging out with the team, looking at their film. I don't know if you've seen that. He posted a picture looking at Commanders film. Like, that's a little bit overkill. Nobody ever wants to come to the Commanders. I doubt he's going to do it. But it feels like he's just using this as ammo against the 49ers to pay him more because wide receivers are resetting the market right now for money, and he wants one of those big contracts. So he's probably just using the Commanders as, hey, I'm going to leave. I want to go to this team. Give me the money that I want. And he's probably going to go back to the 49ers and they're going to pay him a bag. That's what I assume is going to happen. And if that does happen, he's probably going to move up these rankings a good amount because he is essentially the wide receiver 1 on this team. But if he does end up going to a different team like the Steelers, maybe the Commanders, he's going to move down a considerable amount. Just depends where he goes 100%. Keep an eye on that. Or if you don't want to do that manually, hit that subscribe button on this page. I'll be talking about all the fantasy football news all season. It takes 2 seconds and it'll help you out a ton. But next up in this tier, I do have Drake London. I think he's a great player, a great pick. His ADP is just about where it should be, so I'm not itching to get him in every single draft I'm in and reaching on him. It's another one of those situations where we're banking on the improvement because he hasn't had previous numbers in fantasy football to back up taking him this early in drafts. The question is, how much improvement will we see? He finished as a wide receiver 31 in his rookie year, then the wide receiver 37 last year. Again, it's kind of like a Garrett Wilson situation. The Falcons did cut ties with Arthur Smith, which you could accredit to the entire dysfunction of the team last year. And they also brought in Kirk Cousins, who will absolutely take them out of the depths of fantasy football efficiency and NFL efficiency that they were in before. And again, he's young. He's only 23 years old. And if we look at the stats, he was 44th in routes run per game, which is pretty interesting because he was the wide receiver 1 on his team, which would make you think, well, the worst wide receiver 1 is wide receiver 32 as far as total league stats. But no, he was the wide receiver 1 and finished 44th in routes run. And you might be thinking, why are you telling me this? That's not a good stat. The reason is he was not on the field a lot. He was in and out with injuries. He just wasn't being used a ton, and that's going to increase this season. They have Kirk Cousins, and he still managed to average 11 fantasy points a game in a terrible passing offense. So those numbers are all going to improve. He's only 23. He's going into his 3rd season. So any bit of increase in usage and any bit of increased passing efficiency from the quarterback, which 1 will happen and 2 will happen, he's going to easily surpass over 1,000 yards in the season. He'll be perfectly fine. If we're looking at target competition, his only guy in that category is going to be Kyle Pitts. I do think he's a great option in fantasy as well this year. Kirk Cousins has easily supported many fantasy football options in previous years. I'm not worried about it at all, even if he is coming off injury. But moving into the wide receiver 13, I do have Chris Olave. Again, I love him as a player, but fundamentally, I don't think we can take him at that high of an ADP just because of the situation. He still has Derek Carr as a quarterback, nowhere near any of these other guys that we were previously ranking in the wide receiver tiers above him. I will give him credit though, he was playing through injury pretty much the entire season, even if it didn't look like it, he was. But a bit of hope we can hold on to is that there's no more Michael Thomas, and his only target competition is A.T. Perry and Rashid Shaheed. That is pretty much non-existent whatsoever. This team is relatively more pass heavy. Olave is also going to be fully healthy. He's only 24 years old, again, super young, more prime to come, and we want to be drafting wide receivers in this range. And he finished as the wide receiver 16 last year, despite all of that with Michael Thomas target competition, Taysom Hill taking touchdowns, Alvin Kamara, and injuries for quarterbacks and him. So if we're taking him at the wide receiver 13, it seems pretty easy that he's going to outperform his value. But next up, we're going over Deebo Samuel, and I will do it really quickly because, again, this does depend on Brandon Ayuk. If he's not on the team, Deebo's skyrocketing up these rankings, but if he is on the team, he's probably going to stay around this level. The 49ers are good. They have one of the best offenses. They really haven't changed their offense or coaching staff whatsoever. They'll be fine again, Super Bowl contenders again. But at the end of this tier is when it really starts getting interesting for me because I have these 3 guys pretty much tied in my rankings with Adams, Waddle, and Nico in that order for me. If you've watched my previous videos, you know I'm not insanely happy about drafting Devontae Adams, but if we're getting him in the wide receiver 14 to 17 or 18 range, I'm okay with that. He doesn't have the best quarterback situation. It is the worst out of this group of wide receivers, but I do think Gardner Minshew is an upgrade from O'Connell. He was one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL, so anything is going to be an upgrade. Minshew is a little bit slept on, I guess, but it's not the best situation. Like, if he could have gotten to Kirk Cousins in the offseason, we would be putting him way higher up these rankings, but he didn't, and it was kind of just a little bit disappointing. On top of that, they also went ahead and drafted Brock Bowers over the offseason in the draft with a very high pick. He's going to get usage. He's going to be one of the main targets in this offense, and they still have Jacoby Myers. They still have Devontae Adams. There's 3 guys in there that will require a good target share. Can Gardner Minshew support all of these guys, or at least Devontae Adams enough specifically to validate his ADP being this high? That's the question I don't know. And if we look at Waddle, he was a lot better than his fantasy and just NFL numbers in general portrayed him to be. He was the wide receiver 34 last season, and he struggled to stay healthy during the entire year. He only had 3 games over an 80% snap share. That's very, very low. But even though he wasn't on the field much, he got injured a good amount, and he was the wide receiver 2 behind Tyreek Hill. He still managed to average 15 fantasy points a game. The only drawback that I see with him, and a lot of people are kind of taking more into account than they should, is that they have a pretty tough end of the year schedule, which is going to kind of hurt when you're trying to push for those fantasy football playoffs. But again, it's the Dolphins. You don't really have to be worried about their offense. They're going to pass a lot. Jalen Waddle is pretty much guaranteed to improve from last season. And then we have Nico Collins, who I guarantee his rankings are going to change as we get closer to the season because we simply do not know who's going to be the wide receiver 1. As far as we know, it's Nico Collins right now for number 1. He's being drafted in fantasy football drafts the earliest. then it's Stephon Diggs, then it's Tank Dell. That makes the most sense. In my mind, it will be Nico Collins as the wide receiver 1, but it's a guarantee that this overall target distribution is gonna be a lot more, and they're not gonna be able to give Nico Collins a 30% target share like he was before, just because there's so many options. They have Joe Mixon now too. There's a lot of options in this offense, so he's gonna come down a little bit. He might be a bit more risky and volatile. He's still going to be a good wide receiver though. And moving down to the next tier, I do have DJ Moore. Everybody has a different opinion on him, so I'm going to give you mine and the statistics behind it. He will be solid. That is a guarantee, but it entirely depends on Caleb Williams and what he can actually do. And we all know there's an insane amount of target competition because we have DJ Moore, presumably the number 1. Then you have Keenan Allen, a prominent wide receiver 1, even though he's like 32 years old. Rome Odunze, who they just drafted. They also have DeAndre Swift, who's going to get work out of the receiving game. Cole Kmet, who's pretty decent if you want to add him to that list. There is just so many ways this offense could go, and he's extremely going to be boomer bust this year. One day it'll be a Keenan Allen game, he'll get like 2 touchdowns. The other day it'll be a DJ Moore game and he'll get a touchdown, and Keenan Allen will be trash and Rome Odunze will get 2 catches. DJ Moore was surviving off an insane target share last year, but that's just guaranteed to come down, even if Caleb Williams is one of the best quarterbacks in the world. But the reason I am somewhat confident in taking him as the wide receiver 1 above these other guys is that he is projected for more yards and touchdowns compared to them all in sportsbooks. So again, it gives you that secondary backing. But then we have Mike Evans, who is one of the most consistent wide receivers in the NFL. He barely gets injured. He's graded out as a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy football every single year. It's another one of those Devontae Adams situations where we know he's going to be solid, he's going to be great, but he doesn't carry that wide receiver 1 upside or top 5 fantasy football wide receiver upside as some of the other guys above him in this tier. The offense has barely changed. Baker Mayfield has proven to be a pretty decent quarterback that can support multiple guys. I do think his touchdown number is going to come down from last year though. It was at 13. That's relatively high. I expect more like 9, maybe 10. He is 30 years old though. For a wide receiver in fantasy football, he is getting up there, but it's one of those picks to where if you get a Marvin Harrison in the first couple rounds, you might want to take him just for that security to flip-flop. Grouping him into this tier is Stephon Diggs. Again, a guy that is going to change as the season goes on. I expect him to be the wide receiver 2. I know he left a bad taste in everybody's mouth going from 7 catches a game to 4 at the end of last season. There definitely are some red flags with a bunch of target competition, but he has CJ Stroud. He is one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, even if he is getting a little bit old. He's still good. He's still perfectly fine. But again, I don't see him pushing for that top 5 wide receiver in fantasy football as some of these other guys. And Devonta Smith is another great option. I was a bit higher on him when we can get him in the late 3rd, early 4th. But now he's creeping into the early 3rd, and I think that's a little bit high. Like we talked about with AJ Brown, I think Kellen Moore in this offense is really going to shorten the gap between the wide receiver 1 and 2 and make them a lot closer in value and just fantasy points in general. He finished as a wide receiver 19 last season, which is pretty much exactly where we're drafting him this year as the wide receiver 20. I think the wide receiver 20 is his floor. If you do think AJ Brown might get injured, he's going to be a top wide receiver every single week. But again, we cannot predict injuries. That's just not how we work around here. The offense hasn't changed much. They're good. They added Saquon. There's going to be a bit more competition, but he's still going to be a fine wide receiver option. Moving it down to this next tier of wide receivers, again, this one is tough for me because they all equally have their own red flags. But my order is going to be DK Metcalf, T. Higgins, and then Michael Pittman. DK at number 1. He has Geno Smith, who's not the best quarterback in the world. He's viable though, and they have an offensive coordinator and coaching change, which makes a lot of people speculate they're going to stick more to the pass game and actually use their weapons, which I wouldn't be surprised about if they did do that. But that would be a pretty good thing if they use their wide receivers more, are more pass heavy. I think Geno Smith can handle that. And DK Metcalf averages 900 yards a season, so he's a pretty safe pick. And then we have T. Higgins. If he stays with the Bengals and stays fully healthy the entire season, he's easily going to walk past this ADP and perform a lot better. Joe Burrow will hopefully be fully healthy again, like we talked about with Jamar Chase. His offense will be better. The offensive line is getting healthy, even though it's not the best. And again, we're kind of buying into the hope and the potential with T. Higgins because he's never finished better than the wide receiver 20, and he's only 25 years old. He has more prime to go. He's an amazing wide receiver. His numbers just haven't valued that because of Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow getting injured and playing with Jake Browning. He's a fine wide receiver. If he stays with the Bengals, he will outperform his ADP. And then you have Michael Pittman, who again is in line to make a jump with Anthony Richardson at quarterback, hopefully healthy the full season. Despite the name value, there is some competition in this wide receiver room with Josh Downs, Alec Pierce, and Mitchell, who they just drafted. But his touchdown potential is going to be a lot lower than these other wide receivers in this group of 3 guys because they have Anthony Richardson, who's going to take a lot of rushing touchdowns and just a lot of rushing yards in general. And they still have Jonathan Taylor, who's going to be that red zone guy too. And the sports books do back this because he's only projected for 5 touchdowns on the season. That's pretty low considering he's a clear-cut wide receiver 1. If Anthony Richardson can be a great quarterback and actually support passing options in the receiving game, then he'll be perfectly fine. It's just a bit of a question mark with that. He could be a boom, he could be an absolute bust. But we're taking him low enough to where I don't think the bust potential is really that much to worry about. But going on to the next guy, Zay Flowers here, another pretty decent option for the ADP. And it seems like the only reason we're taking him this low is because there's so many great wide receiver options this season. Like, he's a good wide receiver. There's really nothing bad to say about about him. He's the number one option in this Ravens offense that really don't have that much target competition outside of Mark Andrews. And he has a great offense and a great quarterback in Lamar Jackson. They got Derrick Henry. This offense should be able to move a lot more, and he's going to be that number one receiving option. It's perfectly fine. I think he's a great pick. And next up on this list, on the tier rankings, I do have Malik Neighbors, and this is one that I've been back and forth on again because I really just cannot trust the Giants offense for anything. And I do think he's more of a boomer bust kind of guy. He was a great wide receiver in college. I think he's very talented, but you have Daniel Jones coming off an ACL tear, who's already not the best quarterback in the league. And now he doesn't have Saquon Barkley, who is pretty much his safety blanket to get yards and keep the offense moving. He doesn't have that anymore. So he's going to actually have to put the ball on the ground, or he's just going to have to make decisions. It's going to be a little tough. If Daniel Jones can make the jump to improve at quarterback, Malik Neighbors is going to be perfectly fine at the ADP we're drafting him at. I just don't know if I trust that enough. Next up on this list, I have George Pickens. This one, again, kind of scares me, but I do think the quarterback situation is better. Almost anything's better than Kenny Pickett, regardless of if it's Justin Fields. But he's going insanely low for a wide receiver one. They don't have Deontay Johnson on the team anymore, so there's pretty much zero wide receiver competition. And then I'll take Cooper Kupp next, who's another guy with some red flags. But he is 31 years old. He's on a great offense. He's a pretty good wide receiver still. Matthew Stafford can support him, but he's going to effectively be moving down to the wide receiver 2 in his own offense behind Puka. He's only had 2 seasons ever where he finished better than the wide receiver 5, despite how good he was a couple seasons ago. So it might feel like a safe pick, but I'm a little bit more hesitant on taking him than the consensus is. But speaking of aging wide receivers, I do have Keenan Allen next on this list. And if you were to tell me that he would finish as like a top 10 wide receiver, top 5 wide receiver last season in fantasy football at age 31, I'd be like, wow, that's pretty impressive. I'm not going to lie. But if you look at the situation with the Chargers, there was virtually no target competition. Mike Williams was injured all season. And again, with all these Bears wide receivers, we are just completely banking that Caleb Williams can be this guy and support multiple players. But if Caleb Williams is really good and he can do that, he's going to smash his ADP. He's a very talented wide receiver, even if he is getting a bit old. But speaking of risk, I have Amari Cooper left on this list behind him, and this does come down strictly to Deshaun Watson. We gave him a chance on the Browns for virtually, well, a season and a half, 2 seasons if you want to call it that, and he really has done absolutely nothing in that time. And at first I was giving him the benefit of the doubt. You're getting thrown into this team after not playing football for who knows how many years. What was it, 2, 3? I understand that he's going to be a little bit rusty, but he just has not improved, and he absolutely needs to make the jump this season for anything in this offense to be viable. Because now Amari Cooper actually has some target competition with Jerry Jeudy. Yes, he's not the best wide receiver in the world, but it's more than he had before. Amari Cooper is still an amazing wide receiver. I think he has the talent to finish as a top guy, but it all depends on Deshaun Watson. And the next wide receiver in this tier is Tank Dell. We can't just completely forget about him because they have Stephon Diggs now and a bunch of receivers. Yes, there is way too much target competition on this team on a week-to-week basis for him to be a safe guy, but the talent and speed of Tank Dell is going to keep him on the field. Obviously, even if he is the wide receiver 3, he can make the case to be that number 2. And if he does, you're going to be very, very glad that you took him at this ADP. And a couple honorable mentions is Marquise Brown, Chris Godwin, and Christian Kirk. I think these are some great guys I want to highlight, even if they're not technically in this tier list. Hollywood Brown is playing with Patrick Mahomes. He's going to be the number 1 wide receiver, especially if Rashid Rice misses time with suspension. It's a great offense. He's going to be fine. He's going pretty low. Godwin is 28 years old. He's still very much in his wide receiver prime, even if he's going to start plateauing soon. He averages 1,000 yards a season for the past 3 seasons. He's very, very dependable, even if he's kind of behind everybody else in the name value that people want to draft. He's also had 3 straight seasons under 5 touchdowns a season, which is kind of keeping his fantasy value that low, because if the variance just gave him 2 or 3 more touchdowns, we'd be taking him a lot higher. And Christian Kirk, he's wide receiver 1 on the Jaguars. They lost Zay Jones. They lost Calvin Ridley. They don't have much target competition outside of Evan Ingram. He's a fine pick. I don't think people are giving him enough credit. That is going to finish off this video. I seriously appreciate you guys watching all the way through. If you guys haven't seen the running back tier list video, I'll go ahead and put a card in here so you guys can watch that. It's a great video. Timestamps throughout the whole thing. It takes 2 seconds to watch. I'll see you guys in the next one coming soon.